The day my neighbor demanded that I tear down the retaining wall that had been holding an entire hillside in place for 20 years, I stood in my kitchen staring at the letter in my hands and thought, well, this is either going to be hilarious or ruinously expensive. As it turned out, it became both. The strangest part of the whole thing was that she truly believed the problem sitting in front of her was a stretch of ugly wood, not the 80 tons of soaked Oregon soil quietly waiting for permission to move. Before you imagine some reality TV neighbor war with screaming matches across fences and police cars showing up every weekend, let me rewind a little. I'm not that kind of guy. My name is Luke Harper. I'm 47 years old, and I've run a small landscaping business outside Eugene, Oregon since the late 90s. Dirt, drainage, grading, rock, runoff, that's been my world for a long time. It's not glamorous work, but it keeps the lights on, and it teaches you something most people never really learn. Land is always talking. Water is always planning something. And gravity never, ever takes a day off. Hillsides especially don't care about your sense of style. My wife and I bought our house back in 2002 mostly because it was what we could afford at the time. It's an old cedar place, nothing fancy, but big enough for the kids and with just enough room out back for a small shop where I keep my equipment. The lot did have one big problem, though. The backyard dropped off sharply, about 8 feet, toward the 3 homes below us. During our first winter storm season, I started noticing the warning signs. Small cracks forming in the soil. Fence posts leaning a little more each week. The dirt getting slick and soft after every heavy rain. Nothing dramatic yet, but when you work with land long enough, you learn the difference between harmless mess and the early stages of real trouble. That hillside was whispering trouble, so I built a retaining wall. Not some pretty magazine cover wall. Either I built out of old railroad ties I picked up from a salvage yard outside town. Massive black timbers that smelled like creosote, rain, and about 100 years of hard work. The wall stretched roughly 35 feet across the back of my yard and stood close to 8 feet high. Ugly? Sure, but solid. Behind that wall sat around 180 cubic yards of compacted soil. It wasn't decorative landscaping. It was structural. Without it, the hillside would eventually start paying visits to neighbors downhill, invited or not. Once the wall was in place, everything settled down. My yard leveled out. The homes below stayed dry. One of those neighbors back then was an older guy named Carl Jensen. Carl used to joke that my wall was the best insurance policy he never had to pay for. Carl and his wife were good people, the kind who'd bring over zucchini bread or wave when you passed by the driveway. The other houses changed owners once or twice over the years, but nobody ever complained. Most folks understood the simple truth. The wall wasn't pretty, but it worked. Then Carl's wife passed away, and the following spring he sold the house and moved down to Arizona. About a month later, a moving truck pulled up and out stepped Vanessa Caldwell. You ever meet someone and instantly know they're the kind of person who organizes things that didn't need organizing in the first place? That was Vanessa. Designer sunglasses, spotless white sneakers that had clearly never touched mud, posture like she'd just arrived for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. I later learned she'd also become the president of our little HOA. Before that, the association mostly existed to handle road maintenance and to stop people from leaving broken appliances in their front yards. Nothing dramatic, but once Vanessa arrived, you could feel the atmosphere shift. The first time we talked, things were perfectly polite. I was trimming some shrubs near the fence when she walked over and introduced herself. Bright smile, firm voice, very professional. I welcomed her to the neighborhood. Mentioned Carl had been a good neighbor, told her she'd probably like living there. She nodded, but her attention kept drifting past me toward the retaining wall. Eventually she tilted her head and asked, "So that structure, is that permanent?" I chuckled and said, "Unless gravity retires." She didn't laugh, not even close. Instead, she gave me a tight little smile and simply said, "Interesting." 3 weeks later, a certified letter arrived in the mail. Fancy stationery, perfect typing. The return address listed her design company. The message itself was pure Vanessa. According to her, my retaining wall was visually inconsistent with the aesthetic standards of the community. See, she had just installed one of those sleek infinity pools behind her house. Dark blue tile, resort-style finish, the whole expensive package. And from the edge of her pool deck, if she looked uphill, she could see the top couple feet of my old railroad tie wall. She called it an eyesore. Her proposed solution was simple. I had 30 days to remove the wall and replace it with ornamental stone that matched HOA guidelines. If I refused, the association would fine me $200 per day. I read that letter twice. Then I sat at my kitchen table laughing like a man who'd just been sent an invoice by a tornado. Still, I figured maybe she just didn't understand what the wall actually did. So that evening I walked down the hill to talk with her face to face. She answered the door wearing yoga clothes and holding a glass of sparkling water. Behind her, the new pool stretched across the patio, perfectly smooth, reflecting the sunset like something straight out of a resort advertisement. I'll admit it looked impressive. Expensive impressive. From the far edge of her patio, you could see the top of my wall peeking up the slope. She guided me out back like she was showing off a showroom display. "You see what I mean?" she asked. I looked at the pool, then at the wall, then at the slope between them. "I see a retaining wall that's been holding this hillside in place for 20 years. She laughed lightly, like I'd said something cute. "No, Luke," she said. "What I see is something that belongs behind a tractor barn." That was the moment everything shifted for me, because now I knew it wasn't confusion. It was vanity mixed with authority, and that's a dangerous combination. I pointed down the slope and asked if she'd ever lived on a real clay hillside before, especially with Oregon rain and houses sitting below it. She waved her hand dismissively, like I was talking about the weather. "The wall may have served a purpose once," she said, "but now it's visually offensive." Visually offensive, like the soil would pause halfway down the hill and check whether the landslide complemented her pool tile. I told her that wall was a big reason her yard was flat and stable. She informed me that she designed high-end homes for a living and understood landscaping. I almost smiled at that. Landscaping and slope stability are cousins at best, not twins. Then she said the part that stuck with me the most. I invested a lot into creating this view. There it was. Not safety, not drainage, not property lines. Her view. I went home that night and dug through my filing cabinets until I found the original survey from when we bought the house. The wall sat completely on my property. Then I found a county permit, stamped and approved with structural sign-off. Legal wall, legal placement, legal construction. But here's something you probably already know if you've ever dealt with people like this. Being right is nice. Paperwork wins fights. So I gathered more paperwork. I called a soil engineer I'd worked with before, David Morales. Solid guy, serious expression. The kind of man who studies a hillside the way a doctor studies an x-ray. He came out with a clipboard and spent a long time walking the slope, checking soil density, studying the wall, and looking downhill toward the homes below. Eventually he stood up, brushed the dirt from his hands, and asked, "Who built this?" "I did." He nodded once. "Good work." I won't lie, that felt good to hear. Then he added the part that mattered. "Do not remove it." I asked how bad things could get if the wall disappeared. He looked up at the gray sky and said quietly, "When the rain comes, that slope fails." I paid him $3,200 for a formal engineering report. The report said in clean, polite engineering language exactly what I already knew deep down. Remove wall. High likelihood of slope failure and soil movement toward downhill properties. In plain English, the hill would slide. I mailed Vanessa the engineer's report along with the property survey and permit documents. My letter stayed respectful. No sarcasm. No cheap shots. Just facts. And one clear sentence explaining that if the wall came out, the hillside could collapse onto the properties below. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one came from a law office in Portland. Same demand, same deadline, same threat of fines. And at the bottom was a sentence that made me stare at the page for a full minute. Property ownership does not exempt residents from community design rules. So I called my attorney, Greg Foster. Greg has the kind of face that always looks like he'd rather be fishing, and the kind of brain that gets extremely sharp when someone sends him smug paperwork. He read everything slowly, making a few quiet noises, then leaned back in his chair. "They still want it gone?" he asked. "Yep." "Even after the engineer report?" "Yep." Then Greg smiled. A small smile. A dangerous smile. Give them exactly what they asked for. That was a twist. I'd walked into his office expecting a long legal war. Instead, Greg told me not to stop them. Let them own the decision. Get it in writing. Clean. Clear. Approved by the board. So I sent one more message to the HOA asking them to confirm that the retaining wall needed to be removed to comply with community design standards. 3 days later, the email arrived, signed by Vanessa herself as HOA president. Approved. Remove or replace. I printed that message and slid it into a folder alongside the engineering report. Then I rented an excavator. September 15th was warm and dry. One of those early fall Oregon days that feels almost too peaceful. A few neighbors wandered over when the machine was delivered. Marty, an old friend of Carl's from 2 houses down, leaned on the fence and asked what I was doing. Home improvement, I told him. He snorted and said he'd never heard those words end well. By mid-morning, I was in the excavator cab, pulling railroad ties out one by one. Each timber came loose with a deep cracking sound as the packed earth behind it relaxed. Honestly, it felt wrong, like unbuckling a seatbelt while the car is still moving. About an hour into the work, I glanced downhill and saw Vanessa standing beside her pool, sunglasses on, glass of wine in hand, watching me like she'd already won. When I lifted one of the big timbers free and swung it onto the pile, she raised her glass toward me. "Yeah, that actually happened." 6 hours later, the wall was gone. The slope stood there exposed, steep, damp, quiet. To most people, it probably looked fine. To me, it looked like a loaded spring. Oregon's rainy season was only about a week away. Sure enough, on September 23rd, the first real storm rolled in. Thick clouds, the smell of wet cedar, and steady Pacific rain. By the following night, it was pouring. Before bed, my wife asked if I thought the hill would hold. I told her the truth. I didn't know. Slope failures don't always start with drama. Sometimes they think about it first. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound that definitely wasn't rain. A low rumble, deep and heavy, like a freight train moving underground. I ran to the back window, just in time to see the entire face of the hillside give way. Not a small slump, not a crack. The whole slope collapsed and rolled forward in one massive brown surge. Roots, rocks, wet clay, everything moving together. The noise was unbelievable. Trees snapping, mud roaring, wood breaking, water crashing through debris. The slide slammed straight into Vanessa's backyard. Her beautiful infinity pool vanished beneath a wave of mud. So thick, it looked like the earth itself had stood up and punched her property in the face. The pool fence folded. Water exploded upward. Lights flickered in the houses below. It was over in maybe 15 seconds. My wife stood behind me and asked quietly, "Was that the hill?" "Yeah," I said. "That was the hill." The neighborhood came alive quickly after that. Doors opening. People shouting over the rain. Flashlights flickering everywhere. I threw on a jacket and headed downhill with my own flashlight. Vanessa's pool was half filled with mud. The deep blue tile buried beneath 4 feet of brown sludge. Her equipment shed had taken a hit. Electrical boxes were sputtering in the rain. 2 houses farther downhill had mud pushed against their foundations. Water was forcing its way through basement windows. Then Vanessa ran outside, saw the destruction, and completely lost it. "You did this," she screamed at me through the rain. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't need to. "You asked for the wall to be removed." She said the wall caused it. I told her gravity caused it. She said I knew this would happen. I told her I warned her it might. I even pulled up the engineer's report on my phone, standing there in the rain like it was the most miserable courtroom in Oregon. She slapped my hand away and said it wasn't over. And she was right. It wasn't. The next week was chaos. Insurance adjusters, mud removal crews, structural inspections, contractors everywhere. By the time the numbers came in, for families at claims totaling around $140,000. Vanessa's pool alone was close to $90,000. She called me 3 times. The first call was pure rage. The second call was threats. The third call was quiet. That's usually the voice people use when they finally read the paperwork. Greg sent a letter explaining everything clearly. The wall had been legal, permitted, and structurally sound. It was only removed after written demands from the HOA president, despite a formal engineering warning. Then he included my offer. I was willing to rebuild the wall. Cost $12,800, plus a 10-year maintenance agreement at $850 per year, paid by the HOA, and if they missed a payment by more than 30 days. I reserved the right to remove the wall again. Greg insisted on that clause. I laughed so hard when I read it that I nearly spilled my coffee. 3 weeks later, Vanessa resigned as HOA president. The new HOA board approved the contract, so fast it almost felt rude. By November, my crew and I rebuilt the wall exactly where it always been. Same line, same design, same ugly railroad ties. Solid, honest, doing the job nobody respected until the day it stopped doing it. These days, the hillside sits quietly again. Every October, the HOA mails me a maintenance check right on schedule. Vanessa still lives there. The pool eventually got repaired. She doesn't wave when she sees me anymore. And that's fine. I'm not looking for friendship. But I did learn something from that whole mess. A lot of people think power means being the loudest person in the room, or the one with the nicest patio, or the one who can say standards with a straight face. It doesn't. Real power is knowing what's holding everything together before you start tearing things apart just because they offend your eyes. And every time that maintenance check arrives in my mailbox, I smile a little because the wall she hated so much is still the thing protecting her backyard. So let me ask you something. When someone uses a little authority to force a bad decision, after being warned, and karma shows up fast and muddy, do you call that justice, revenge, or just consequences finally doing their job? Tell me what you think. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA or a neighbor who pushed things too far, I'd love to hear your story too.